Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss the latest on the HS2 chaos, which is now going to cost us more for less. Actually, it's not more for less, it's more for nothing. Due to inflation, the cost of completing the not at all useful remains of the original plan have increased by another 10 billion, only because the government have scrapped any meaningful completion. This now represents much greater cost, partly as a result of the Tories' failure on inflation, which cannot be justified by at least getting an economy boosting benefit. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel. So there's a really clear distinction to be drawn between Labour and the Conservatives on investment. Labour are proposing famously £28 billion a year to invest in green technology, to replace jobs in the oil industry with jobs in developing green engineering, and to produce the products that Britain can sell to the world, assuming we can negotiate our extreme Tory Brexit trade barriers. The investment directly leads to more jobs and growth, which will generate larger tax revenues, which will pay for the cost of that investment. That is how investment is supposed to work. A business doesn't see it as a cost, it sees it as an initial cost for which it recoups the money and makes more in the long run. That's investment. But look what happened to the Tories' investment plans. That HS2 would cost more than originally expected, that is actually understandable. You know, when you have a long-term investment project, it's going to take 15, 20 years, whatever, you're basing the costs on expected inflation. Now, if you're hit with much higher than expected inflation, which can happen, then the costs will of course increase. However, there are three things I'd like to say about that. First, some of our inflation is directly linked to Brexit, which was a Tory policy. That is not to say we wouldn't have an inflation problem right now were it not for Brexit, but it's larger than it would have been. So some of the extra costs are not just down to unfortunate global events, but to the way the Conservatives deliberately hamstrung our finances. Second, some of the increased costs have come about as a result of some dubious decision making. I'll wait for the public inquiry before labelling it as Tory corruption, but I strongly suspect the inquiry is going to turn up evidence of corruption. When people close to the Conservative Party were able to use funds from the scheme to sell houses at high prices, which we know happened, or were able to buy up land cheaply in advance and then sell it to the project at a huge markup, which we know happened, that's dodgy. Right now, I don't know what the scale of this is, but I do know that the project costs ramped up beyond that which can be explained purely by inflation. Third, if the Tories had grown the economy, bear in mind in real terms the economy has shrunk since 2010. If they'd actually grown the economy, then the costs of a project rising with inflation, not actually a big problem, because yes, it means the costs go up higher than expected, but so too do your tax revenues. Because it's not just the cost of the things you're buying that costs more, the cost of the things you're selling costs more. But that only works if the inflation is down to external matters, not your own policy, and you've grown the economy. That the ballooning costs of HS2 became a concern is the result of Tory incompetence and very possibly corruption. I expect corruption. But now the project has been scrapped, completely scrapped basically, aside from a little bit of track, which supposedly connects Birmingham and London, only on close examination doesn't actually go into London and only really brushes Birmingham. Regardless of the semantics of what's left of the plans now, what is clear is that once it is completed, because the answer to this is, once it's completed, does it give people either a faster route between Birmingham or London, or does it provide extra capacity so that more people in a same space of time can get between Birmingham and London? The answer to those questions is no. It doesn't provide either of those. There's no more capacity really, because it doesn't go into Birmingham or London, and it's not faster. HS2 has now become a white elephant, a bit like the Millennium Dome, only way more expensive. HS2 has now officially ceased to be of any value to our economy. In fact, it has become a drain on our economy because the jobs that were based on future work are now no more. Yet we will still be paying for it. And the latest news is that the cost estimates have just gone up another £10 billion. The BBC reported the head of the building company, Sir Jonathan Thompson, saying that, the government are trying to downplay these extra costs. And he says, well, not building the new station at Euston might save some money, but not as much as the government's claiming. Essentially, the Tories are trying to downplay the rising costs of the scheme now that it is of zero economic benefit. And the tragic fact is that we're already decades behind similar economies in terms of high-speed rail. Japan had them in 1960s. Now, we will one day catch up. It's just that we're going to have to start from scratch again and fund it from scratch again. So I'm not expecting anything anytime soon. I think we're probably going to have to wait another generation before anyone can sensibly look at our railway infrastructure, such as the bloody nose we've got from HS2. Like, Labour have plans to nationalise rail companies. That'll help deliver better value for money, but it won't build our rail network up. That can't really be achieved if you keep letting the Tories in every decade or so, because whatever long-term plan you put in place, they just wreck. We need electoral reform to make sure that Parliament is representative of the country, and then we'll start to see policies in the long-term interests of the country. Because the fact is, public opinions generally change quite slowly, much more slowly than governments. If we want long-term planning, we need long-term politics. Proportional representation will stabilise it. The governments will still change. It won't mean we have the same government stretched into the future. The governments will change. But the reflection of what the public want that government to do will not. Hague is Labour's Louise Hague, who will be the Transport Secretary after the election, is saying that Labour will commission an expert review of our transport infrastructure. It's great. I fully support that. But I already know what's going to happen. I sort of know the gist of what it will conclude, that we are badly behind other advanced economies and we are going to have to pay an eye-watering sum to catch up. Labour will inherit a knackered economy and loads of really good investment ideas and unable to fund all of them. So it'll be a few at a time. The ones that give the biggest, shortest term return, right? The author of the eventual report will produce this fantastic roadmap, this series of long-term projects which will modernise, revolutionise our transport infrastructure, boost our economy, be fantastic. And Labour will have to go, can we have the cheaper option, please? Because the Tory media will attack any form of investment whatsoever. We've seen what they're doing with the £28 billion worth of green investment. It's no coincidence that after 14 years, the Tories cannot point to a single example of major investment in this country on their watch. Not one single project. Used to be HS2, now that's gone. Ask them to name a Tory investment project. Go on. What are they going to say? Oh, we're going to fill in some potholes by 2030. Literally, that's what Sunak described as investment last year. And the problem with this transport white elephant, it's not just because the Tories buggered up the economy and then put a political imbecile in charge of first our economy and then the entire country. As Labour's Louise Hague points out, much of the problem is that ministers produce their plans without consulting experts. This is not news, of course. Sunak cancelled HS2 last year to general surprise. Now, if there's been a government study involving stakeholders and experts, and the published report recommended the scrapping of HS2 and the development of this Network North, right, where most of the projects are actually in the south, that wouldn't have been a surprise, because we'd have known an investigation was underway, this feasibility study, and we sort of, like, whenever there's an investigation, you always get some sense of its conclusions before it's published, long before it's published. Case in point, the COVID inquiry is set to report its first, publish its first report before summer, they say, so probably in the next few months. We already know what its main conclusions are going to be. The news are quite happily reporting on it. We know that. We don't know the detail, we know what the general conclusions are. Because that's what happens when there's an investigation involving lots of people. People talk and other people listen and write about it in the newspapers. With HS2, we had this bizarre situation last autumn. The Transport Secretary, Mark Harper, was making a speech, public speech, saying that the government were committed to HS2. And then 3 days later, it was being reported in the news that Sunak was going to scrap it completely. Then we had a week or two of Sunak saying, oh, I haven't made a final decision yet. Then, in his big speech at the conference, he announced, surprise, surprise, that actually he was going to scrap it, just like the news had been reporting, days earlier. The Transport Secretary probably had no idea about the plan until he read it in the news at the same time as I did. But whether or not the Transport Secretary had anything to do with the decision, or whether he was just lying to the public a few days before the news broke, doesn't matter. What is known with certainty is that experts were not involved. Network North is a purely political device. It's not a transport project. It's a political device to distract people in the north of England from the lack of investment. That is why only politicians and political advisors had anything to do with it. It's also why it went to shit literally a day after the announcement. When people pointed out, hang on a minute, some of these schemes on this map have already been completed. Years ago, in fact. They've already got them. And some of the others look a bit ropey. What's going on with that? Where's the money for this? And Sunak said, oh, no, these aren't real projects. They're just examples of the sorts of things you might do. So Network North is not even a real thing by the admission of the government. So essentially, we're getting nothing. Nothing which can boost the economy. So whatever it costs is costing us now in higher taxes because there'll be no financial return on the investment. And that is why, again, Network North is really just a purely political device. Because there's costs with HS2. There's costs with scrapping HS2. So Sunak's trying to say, oh, we're just going to pump all that money into different projects instead. That's his line, but he's not. There's going to be no money for any projects that's going to produce a financial return. So we're paying now this cost, tens of billions, which has now just gone up by another 10 billion for nothing. You know, the Tories try to appeal to the public by saying they can do everything Labour does, but for less money. Oh, you'll still get all these fantastic services, all this fantastic investment. We'll just do it for cheaper, we'll do it more efficiently, right? But you get what you pay for. The Tories are cowboys, really. Oh, you were quoted £25,000 for that renovation job? Yeah, we can do it for £5,000 no £5,000, no problem at all. 2 weeks later, your house is no longer fit for human habitation. That is what the Tories are. That's what they do to the country. It's government on the cheap. Not that it works out cheaply in the end when you have to pay for the consequences. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, the join button for memberships. And until next time, I'll see you later.